The fluorescent lights above the register flickered and hummed, casting a sickly glow over the rows of chips and canned soup. Clara Westbrook wiped down the counter for the third time that evening, her hands moving in mechanical circles while her mind wandered to the rent due in 5 days and the calculations that never quite added up. The convenience store smelled like burnt coffee and floor cleaner, familiar scents that had become the backdrop of her carefully constructed anonymity. A mother entered with a small boy trailing behind her, his sneakers lighting up with each step. The woman was absorbed in her phone, barely glancing up as her son wandered toward the candy aisle. Clara recognized the type, exhausted and stretched thin, present in body, but absent in attention. The boy was maybe 7 years old, with dark curls and a superhero shirt, humming softly to himself as he studied the rows of chocolate bars with serious concentration. Clara found herself smiling despite her fatigue. The door chimed again. 2 men entered, and everything changed. Clara's smile died. She knew danger when she saw it, had been raised to recognize predators by the way they moved, and these men moved wrong, too casual, too aware. The first wore a ski mask pulled low. The second had a bandana tied across his face. Metal flashed. Gun. The word screamed through her mind. The mother looked up from her phone and froze. Her scream was building in her throat but had not yet emerged when Clara moved. Pure instinct overrode thought. She vaulted over the counter section, grabbed Samuel by his small shoulders, and dragged him behind the register. His body was small and warm and trembling as she pushed him down. Covering him with her own body, her arms wrapped around his head. Samuel whimpered into her chest. The gunman was shouting now, words that blurred together into meaningless noise. Clara felt her hair come loose from its clip, the long strands falling across her neck and shoulders as she pressed herself tighter against the terrified child. She could hear the mother sobbing, the register drawer slamming open, the rustle of cash being stuffed into a bag. Samuel's small hands clutched at her uniform shirt. Time stretched and contracted. Seconds felt like hours. Then running footsteps, the door chiming again, and sudden terrible silence. Clara stayed frozen, her heart slamming against her ribs, Samuel's tears soaking through her shirt. When she finally lifted her head, the store was empty except for the mother, who rushed forward with a wail to pull her son from Clara's arms. Clara stood on shaking legs, pushing her hair back from her face with trembling fingers. Through the window, she saw a black car pulling up to the curb, sleek and expensive and utterly out of place in this neighborhood. A man emerged, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a suit that probably cost more than Clara made in 6 months. He moved with absolute certainty, like someone accustomed to space clearing around him. When he entered the store, his eyes swept the scene with quick assessment before landing on Clara. She felt pinned by that gaze, dark and measuring and far too intelligent. His attention dropped briefly to her neck, and something shifted in his expression, a sharpening that made her suddenly, acutely aware of what he might have seen. Her hand flew to her nape, fingers covering the tattoo she usually kept hidden beneath her hair. Too late. The man's voice was smooth and controlled when he spoke. "Is everyone all right? Not a question. A command for information." Clara nodded, not trusting her voice. He looked at the mother and child, then back to Clara, and she felt stripped bare under that scrutiny. He approached the counter where the store owner had emerged from the back room, hands shaking. The man in the suit left a card, his words about protection and safety, but his eyes never left Clara. When he finally departed, sliding back into the black car that purred away into the night, Clara realized she was more afraid now than she had been with guns pointed in her direction. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. Clara's apartment building squatted between a laundromat and a closed bodega, its brick facade stained with decades of exhaust and neglect. She climbed the 3 flights of stairs because the elevator had been broken for 2 months, her legs heavy with exhaustion that had nothing to do with physical effort. Her hands shook as she fumbled with the key, and when she finally pushed through the door, Eleanor looked up from the sagging couch with concern already etched across her face. "You look terrible," Eleanor said, setting aside her laptop. "What happened?" Clara tried to construct an explanation that would satisfy without revealing anything, but her carefully built walls were crumbling. "There was a robbery at the store. I am fine, just shaken." Eleanor was beside her in an instant, guiding her to sit, asking questions Clara could not fully answer. She accepted a cup of tea she did not want, and listened to Eleanor's outrage about neighborhood safety, while her mind spun in entirely different directions. When Eleanor finally retreated to her room, Clara stood and moved to the bathroom, closing the door and staring at her reflection in the spotted mirror. She reached back and touched the tattoo at her nape, tracing the intricate symbol she had not chosen but could never escape. The mark of the Westbrook family. Her father's brand burned into her skin when she was 16, a declaration of ownership in a world where daughters were property and leverage. Victor Westbrook had ruled his territory with methodical brutality, and Clara had grown up in a fortress that was also a prison, surrounded by armed men and silence. She had learned early to be invisible, to move through rooms like a ghost, because attention was dangerous. When rivals ambushed her father's convoy 5 years ago, turning 3 cars into twisted metal and fire, Clara had been at the estate. She had heard the news and understood immediately that this was her single chance. She had taken cash hidden in her room, walked out through the chaos of panic and power vacuum, and disappeared into a city that did not know her face. She had kept her name because changing it felt like letting her father win, like admitting she was still his possession even in death. For 5 years she had worked cash jobs, lived small, avoided cameras and databases, and anything that might ping on someone's radar. She had believed she was safe. She had been wrong. That night she lay in her narrow bed and stared at the water stain on the ceiling, listening to the building settle and creak around her. Sleep felt impossible. Her mind kept replaying the moment the man in the expensive suit had looked at her neck, the way his expression had shifted from concern to calculation. She knew what he had seen. She knew what it meant. Across the city in a renovated warehouse that served as the operational heart of his empire, Alexander Thornhill stood before floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the docks. Henry Carstairs waited behind him, patient and silent as always. "Find out everything about her," Alexander said quietly. "The cashier from the convenience store. Her name, her history, where she came from." Henry did not ask why. He simply nodded and left to execute the order. Alexander remained at the window, his reflection ghostly in the glass. He had recognized the tattoo instantly, had felt the shock of it travel through him like voltage. The Westbrook family was supposed to be extinct, wiped out in the territorial wars 5 years ago. Victor Westbrook had been a problem Alexander's predecessor had solved with extreme prejudice. But apparently some remnant had survived, and now she was in his city, working a register and shielding children from gunfire. He did not believe in coincidence. He needed to know if she was a threat, a plant, some delayed revenge scheme. He also needed to understand why the sight of her had affected him so strongly, why her frightened defiance had lodged itself in his mind. The next morning, Clara arrived at work to find her manager hovering near the door, his nervousness palpable. "Someone was here asking about you," he said, not meeting her eyes. "Man in a nice suit. Wanted to know your schedule, how long you had worked here. Did not give a name." Clara felt ice crystallize in her chest. "What did you tell him?" "Nothing. I mean, just that you were a good worker." He left. Clara's anxiety spiked into something close to panic. She considered walking out, disappearing again, but she had barely $400 saved and nowhere to go. Running required resources she did not have. She was trapped by poverty as much as by the past. The afternoon shift dragged with unbearable slowness, each minute stretching into something thick and suffocating. Clara restocked shelves that did not need restocking, wiped counters already clean, Anything to keep her hands busy and her mind from spiraling into panic. The store was nearly empty. Just an old man reading magazines near the back and the hum of refrigerators filling the silence. When the door chimed, she looked up automatically, and her heart stopped. Alexander Thornhill walked in as if he owned the space, as if the fluorescent lights and chipped linoleum were as natural to him as whatever marble halls he usually inhabited. He wore a different suit today, charcoal gray, that fit him like a second skin, and his eyes found her instantly, with that same unsettling focus. The old man glanced up, seemed to sense something in the air, and quickly left. Clara was alone. Alexander approached the counter with measured steps, each one deliberate, and she felt like prey watching a predator close the distance. He stopped on the other side of the register, close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive and cedar dark. "You were very brave the other night," he said, his voice smooth as silk over steel. "The child was fortunate you were here." Clara forced herself to meet his gaze. "I did what anyone would do." "No," he said, "you did what someone trained to assess danger and act without hesitation would do. Interesting skill set for a convenience store cashier." Her throat tightened. "I do not know what you mean." Alexander tilted his head slightly, studying her like she was a puzzle he intended to solve. "I think you do. I noticed something distinctive about you. The tattoo on your neck." Clara's hand moved involuntarily toward her nape, fingers brushing the collar of her shirt. "It is nothing. Just a stupid mistake from when I was younger." He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "That is not a mistake. That is a family mark." The Westbrook family, unless I am very much mistaken. The air left her lungs. She considered lying, constructing some story, but the look in his eyes told her he already knew. She gripped the edge of the counter to steady herself. "I left that life behind. I want nothing to do with any of it." "Did you?" he asked, leaning forward slightly. "Because that mark says otherwise. Your father's organization owed a blood debt to my family. Debts like that do not disappear just because you decide to stock shelves and pretend you are someone else." Clara felt anger flare through her fear, hot and bright. "I had no choice about being born into that family. I was a prisoner there, not a participant. When my father died, I escaped. I have spent 5 years building a life that has nothing to do with that world. I have hurt no one. I just want to be left alone." Alexander's expression shifted, something that might have been respect flickering across his features. "Admirable, but unfortunately irrelevant. Your presence in my city is a complication. Thomas Greville, a business rival of mine, would be very interested to know Victor Westbrook's daughter is here, unprotected and vulnerable. You are a liability whether you intend to be or not." "So what are you going to do?" Clara asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "Kill me to solve your problem." He looked genuinely surprised. "No. But I will be watching you. Closely." He straightened and turned toward the door, then paused and looked back. "Whether you like it or not, Clara Westbrook, you are now my concern." When he left, the bell chiming cheerfully behind him, Clara realized she was shaking and that her carefully constructed anonymity had just shattered into pieces she could never put back together. The days that followed felt like living underwater, every sound muffled and every movement slow and deliberate as Clara navigated a reality that had shifted beneath her feet. She became acutely aware that she was being watched, the prickling sensation between her shoulder blades constant and inescapable. On her walk to work, she spotted the same black sedan parked 2 blocks from her apartment, different driver each time but always the same make and model. At the corner store near the bus stop, a man in a gray jacket pretended to read a newspaper, but his eyes tracked her movements with professional detachment. Even inside the convenience store, she felt the weight of surveillance. Cameras that were not there before, or maybe had always been there, but now felt malicious. Henry Carstairs was thorough in ways that made Clara understand why Alexander trusted him with his empire. Across the city in the renovated warehouse, Alexander sat at his desk reviewing reports that Henry delivered with quiet efficiency. Clara Westbrook, 28 years old, current residence a rundown apartment on the east side, employed at the convenience store for 7 months prior to that, a series of similar positions always paid in cash. No credit cards, no social media presence, no digital footprint that suggested anything beyond basic survival. She had been living under her real name, but completely off the grid. No contact with any known criminal organizations or remnants of her father's network. Bank account held $380. She appeared to be exactly what she claimed, a woman trying to escape, but Alexander found himself unable to simply file the information away and move on. He studied the surveillance photos Henry had included, images of Clara walking to work with her shoulders hunched against the cold, Clara stocking shelves with her hair pulled back and exhaustion etched in every line of her posture, Clara sitting alone on a bench during her break, staring at nothing. There was something compelling about her resilience, the way she held herself together despite the obvious fear that shadowed her eyes. She had every reason to crumble under the weight of her circumstances, yet she showed up and worked and survived with a quiet determination that stirred something in his chest. He did not want to examine too closely. He decided he needed to confront her again, but this time in a controlled environment where he could truly assess whether she was a threat or simply collateral damage from a war that ended before she escaped. The message was delivered to the convenience store on a thick cream cardstock that looked absurd next to the faded lottery advertisements and handwritten signs. An invitation to dinner at Luciano's, the most exclusive restaurant in the city, a place where reservations required weeks of notice unless your name carried the kind of weight that made maitre d's scramble. The note was polite, almost formal, but Clara understood the subtext immediately. This was not optional. She held the card with shaking hands and felt fury rise hot and bright through her fear. She considered ignoring it, not showing up, forcing him to make the next move. But she knew that would only make things worse and potentially more public. That evening, she stood in front of the narrow closet she shared with Eleanor and stared at her meager collection of clothes, nothing remotely appropriate for a place like Luciano's. Eleanor noticed her distress and, without asking too many questions, offered a simple black dress she had worn to a wedding last year, slightly too big in the shoulders, but passable. Clara arrived at the restaurant feeling like an imposter among the wealthy patrons in their designer clothes and careless elegance, and when the host led her to a private room in the back, her heart hammered against her ribs. Alexander stood when she entered, unfolding from his chair with fluid grace, and for a moment she forgot her anger and fear and simply registered the physical impact of him. Tall and broad-shouldered, dark hair precisely cut, eyes that missed absolutely nothing, he commanded space in a way that made the elegant room feel small. The dinner began with uncomfortable formality, the kind that made Clara feel like an actress who had forgotten her lines and was desperately improvising in front of a hostile audience. Alexander gestured for her to sit in the chair opposite him at a table set with white linens and crystal that caught the candlelight in fractured rainbows, and she lowered herself carefully, hyper-aware of every movement. He ordered for both of them without consulting her, speaking to the hovering waiter in fluent Italian, a move that irritated her in ways she could not fully articulate, but she bit her tongue hard enough to taste copper. When the waiter disappeared, Alexander turned his full attention to her, those dark eyes that missed nothing scanning her face, as if reading a document written in a language only he understood. "Tell me about your life," he said. And it was not quite a question, but not quite a command either, something in between that left her no room to refuse. Clara kept her answers sparse, clipped sentences that gave information without offering vulnerability. She explained that her father had kept her isolated in a compound outside the city, that she had been more prisoner than princess, educated by tutors and monitored by guards who reported her every movement. When he died in a coordinated attack by rivals, she had seen her chance and taken it, walking away from the burning compound with nothing but the clothes she wore and a few $100s stolen from a safe. She had been alone ever since, working cash jobs and moving whenever she felt eyes on her, surviving rather than living. Alexander listened with an intensity that made her skin prickle, leaning forward slightly, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. He asked why she had not changed her name, why she would keep something so identifying when she was trying to disappear. Clara felt something crack open in her chest, a small fissure that let truth leak through. She admitted she kept it because it was the only thing that felt like hers, not her father's legacy or his crimes, but her own identity, the one piece of herself that belonged to no one else. Alexander's expression shifted, something that might have been respect or recognition softening the hard lines of his face. The conversation turned then, the interrogation becoming something more like an exchange. He told her about his own upbringing, raised inside the organization from the time he could walk, trained from childhood to lead and make decisions that would determine whether people lived or died. He described it as a cage made of gold, beautiful and suffocating, and Clara realized with a jolt that they had more in common than she had expected. The tension between them shifted, becoming less adversarial and more charged with a different kind of energy, something electric that made the air feel too thin. Alexander admitted he had confirmed through his inquiries that she was not a threat, that she had no ties to any remaining Westbrook operations, but that her tattoo made her a target for others who remembered the name and the blood debts associated with it. Thomas Greville, a rival who had been trying to expand into Alexander's territory for months, would be very interested to know that Victor Westbrook's daughter was alive and unprotected in the city, a perfect tool for leverage or revenge. Clara felt the trap closing tighter around her, the walls contracting until she could barely breathe. Alexander leaned back in his chair and made his offer with the calm assurance of a man who knew she had no real choice. His protection in exchange for her cooperation. She would stay in the city, continue her life, but under his watch and occasionally under his guidance. Clara asked what cooperation meant, her voice steadier than her hands. Alexander was blunt, his honesty almost brutal. He needed to know she would not be used against him, and he might occasionally need information about her father's old network, contacts and territories and debts that might still be relevant. Clara felt backed into a corner, but she also realized that refusal was not really an option, not when the alternative was being hunted by men like Greville or worse. Clara agreed to Alexander's terms, though every instinct screamed at her to run, to pack the few belongings she owned, and disappear into another city where no one knew her name or the mark she carried. But she was tired of running, and some part of her recognized that Alexander represented a different kind of cage, one that might protect as much as it confined. The arrangements were made with the swift efficiency that characterized everything in Alexander's world. Within 48 hours, Clara found herself standing in a new apartment in a building Alexander owned, a modest but clean space that represented a significant upgrade from the cramped room she had shared with Eleanor. The walls were freshly painted in soft gray, the appliances actually worked, and the windows looked out onto a quiet street lined with trees instead of cracked pavement and graffiti. Clara protested that she did not want his charity, pride making her voice sharper than was probably wise given the power imbalance between them. Alexander leaned against the doorframe and regarded her with an expression that might have been amusement, telling her this was practical security, not charity, that he needed to know where she was and that she was safe. Eleanor was suspicious about the sudden change, her questions pointed and concerned. But Clara could not tell her the truth without pulling her into a danger she had no part in. She invented a story about a rent-controlled opening and a stroke of good luck, and Eleanor accepted it, though her eyes suggested she knew there was more to the story. As Clara settled into the new space, unpacking her meager possessions and trying to make the apartment feel like hers, she found herself thinking about Alexander more than she wanted to. He was dangerous, controlling, everything she had tried to escape when she walked away from her father's compound. But there had been something in his eyes during dinner, a loneliness that mirrored her own, a sense that he too was trapped by circumstances and legacy and choices made long before he was born. Days passed in a strange new rhythm. Clara continued working at the convenience store because she needed the normalcy and the income, but now she occasionally saw Henry Carstairs checking in, his presence both reassuring and unnerving. Alexander himself appeared unexpectedly one afternoon, walking into the store as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He offered to drive her home, and Clara found herself agreeing despite the curious looks from her co-workers. In the car, the confined space made the attraction between them almost tangible, a living thing that filled the air and made breathing difficult. Alexander asked about her day as if he genuinely cared, as if she were more than an obligation or a problem to be managed. Clara was confused by his attention, unable to reconcile this version of him with the cold businessman who had interrogated her over dinner. She asked him directly why he was doing this, why he cared at all about her mundane day, or whether she liked the new apartment. Alexander was silent for a long moment, his hands tightening on the steering wheel, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than she had ever heard it. He admitted he was not entirely sure himself, that something about her bravery with the child in the store, her determination to build a different life despite impossible odds, resonated with him in ways he could not fully explain. He had spent his entire life in a world where loyalty was bought and sold, where everyone had an angle and trust was a weakness to be exploited. Clara seemed different, genuine in a way that felt rare and precious. The vulnerability in his admission caught Clara completely off guard, cracking through her defenses and letting her see past the powerful crime lord to the man underneath, the one who carried burdens he had never chosen and dreamed of escapes he would never take. Over the following weeks, Alexander and Clara fell into an unexpected rhythm that felt both natural and impossible, as if they were building something fragile and precious on ground that might crack open beneath them at any moment. He stopped by the convenience store at odd hours, sometimes in the morning before she had properly woken up, and sometimes in the late afternoon when the light slanted gold through the grimy windows, and he always brought coffee for her, the expensive kind from a place 3 blocks away that she had mentioned liking once in passing. They talked. Conversations that started superficial and safe, but gradually deepened into territory that felt dangerous in a different way than physical threats. And Clara learned things about him that surprised her every time. Alexander read philosophy, dense books by writers she had never heard of, and he could quote passages about freedom and moral responsibility with a bitter irony that made her chest ache. He supported several charities anonymously, children's hospitals and shelters for abuse victims, causes he never took credit for because he said his name would taint the good they did. He hated the violence of his world with a quiet intensity that radiated from him when he spoke about it, but he felt trapped by legacy and responsibility and the knowledge that stepping away would create a power vacuum filled by men far worse than himself. Alexander in turn discovered that Clara loved old movies, black and white films from the 1940s, with glamorous heroines and impossible romances, and that she was teaching herself to paint by watching online tutorials on the store's computer during slow periods. He learned she had a sharp wit hidden beneath her caution, a dry humor that emerged when she felt safe enough to let her guard slip, and that she noticed details about people that most others missed. The attraction between them intensified with every interaction, touches lingering a fraction too long, his hand on her arm or her fingers brushing his when he handed her coffee, and eye contact that held seconds past comfortable into something that made her stomach flip and her skin heat. Clara knew she was playing with fire, but she could not seem to stop herself, drawn to him despite every rational objection her mind offered. Alexander was intoxicated by her, by the way she challenged him without cruelty and refused to cower even when she was clearly afraid, and by the resilience that let her build a life from nothing and still find joy in small things. One evening, Alexander invited Clara to a gallery opening, a legitimate public event hosted by a museum board he served on, and Clara was nervous but agreed because refusing felt like cowardice. She wore a borrowed dress from Eleanor, simple black with a fitted bodice and flowing skirt, and when Alexander picked her up, the look in his eyes made her breath catch and her pulse stutter. At the gallery, Clara was acutely aware of the stares and whispers that followed them, every person in the room recognizing Alexander Thornhill and wondering who she was and what she meant to him. Alexander kept a possessive hand on the small of her back, a touch that was both protective and claiming, and when a business associate made a dismissive comment about Clara being his latest distraction, Alexander's response was cold and immediate, and left no room for misunderstanding that she was under his protection. Clara was both unsettled and thrilled by his protectiveness, the public declaration that she mattered to him. On the drive home, the tension that had been building all evening finally reached a breaking point, and Alexander pulled the car over on a quiet street lined with dark storefronts and empty sidewalks. He turned to her and told her he should stay away, that she deserved better than his world and the danger that came with being connected to him. Clara, emboldened by wine and emotion and weeks of wanting, told him she was tired of other people deciding what she deserved. Alexander and Clara sat in the darkened car, with the city lights casting shifting shadows across their faces, illuminating the planes and angles that had become achingly familiar to her over these past weeks. The air between them was electric, charged with all the tension and wanting that had been building since the moment he had first walked into the convenience store and fixed those dark eyes on her like she was a puzzle he needed to solve. Alexander reached out slowly, deliberately giving her time to pull away, or protest, or remember all the rational reasons this was a terrible idea, and cupped her face with a hand that was surprisingly gentle for someone who wielded so much power and violence. His thumb traced her cheekbone in a feather-light touch that sent shivers cascading down her spine and made her breath catch audibly in the confined space. Clara's heart pounded so hard she was sure he could hear it, could feel it where his fingers rested against her jaw, and when he finally closed the distance between them and kissed her, it was both gentle and consuming, a contradiction that somehow made perfect sense. She responded without thinking, without the careful consideration that had governed every interaction with him, until this moment, her hands fisting in the expensive fabric of his shirt and pulling him closer. The kiss deepened, all the weeks of tension and restraint igniting at once into something that felt inevitable and dangerous and right, and Clara lost herself in the sensation of his mouth on hers and the way his hand slid into her hair and the low sound he made that vibrated through her chest. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, the air in the car feeling thin and insufficient, and Alexander rested his forehead against hers, while Clara could feel him trembling slightly, a vulnerability that made her chest ache. He told her this changed everything, his voice rough and low, that once they crossed this line, there was no going back to the careful distance they had been maintaining. Clara knew he was right, knew she was stepping off a cliff into empty air, but she also knew she had already fallen somewhere along the way between his unexpected kindness and the loneliness she recognized in his eyes and the way he looked at her like she mattered. She told him she was not afraid, which was not entirely true, but felt true enough in this moment, and Alexander kissed her again with a desperation that spoke of his own fears and wants. He drove her home eventually, though neither of them seemed eager to end the night, and he walked her to her door, like this was a normal date, and not the collision of two damaged people from violent worlds. He kissed her again at her threshold, slower this time, deliberate and thorough, before forcing himself to step back and leave. Clara entered her apartment in a daze, her lips still tingling and her heart racing, and she knew sleep would be impossible. Over the next few days, their relationship shifted irrevocably into something neither of them could pretend was purely protective or practical. Alexander was more open, letting his guard drop in ways she suspected he rarely allowed, and more tactile, finding excuses to touch her hand or rest his fingers at her waist or tuck her hair behind her ear. He took her to dinner at his private residence, a stunning historic mansion that took her breath away with its soaring ceilings and original woodwork and the kind of wealth she had only glimpsed in her father's world. Clara saw the luxury he lived in, the armed security stationed discreetly at every entrance, the reminders of exactly who and what he was. After dinner, Alexander showed her his private study, a room lined floor to ceiling with books that spoke of a mind hungry for ideas and escape. And they talked for hours about everything and nothing. He told her about the things he had done, the moral compromises and the violence and the choices that haunted him, giving her the chance to walk away with full knowledge of what staying would mean. Clara admitted she was not naive about his world, but she also saw the man trying to be better than his circumstances, the one who carried impossible weight and still found ways to be gentle with her. That night ended with Alexander holding Clara close, both of them acutely aware they were falling into something dangerous and inevitable, something that felt both like salvation and destruction wrapped together in a way neither could untangle. The fragile peace they had built over these past days shattered completely 3 nights later when Thomas Greville made his move with the calculated precision of a man who had been waiting for exactly the right moment to strike. Clara was closing the convenience store on an evening that felt no different from any other, the autumn air carrying a bite that made her pull her jacket tighter as she locked the front door and counted the register in the back office, when 2 men approached her with footsteps so quiet she did not hear them until they were already inside. They were polite in that particular way that made the menace underneath all the more terrifying, dressed in expensive suits that marked them as belonging to someone with power and money, and they delivered their message with calm efficiency that sent ice flooding through her veins. "Greville knows who you are," the taller one said, his voice flat and emotionless. "He knows what you mean to Alexander Thornhill. If Thornhill does not cede the territory on the East Side docks by the end of the week, you will pay the price for his stubbornness." Clara was terrified, her heart hammering so hard she felt dizzy and her hands shaking where she gripped the edge of the counter, but she refused to show it, refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. The men left as quietly as they had come, and she immediately pulled out her phone and called Alexander with fingers that barely functioned. He arrived within minutes, his car screeching to a stop outside, and fury radiating from him in waves so palpable she could feel them from across the room when he strode through the door. Henry Carstairs and several other men secured the area with military precision, checking exits and securing perimeters, while Alexander pulled Clara into his arms and held her so tightly she could barely breathe. He took her back to his mansion without discussion, his jaw set, and his eyes cold in a way that reminded her exactly who and what he was, insisting she could not return to her apartment or anywhere else that was not under his direct protection. Clara was shaken. The abstract danger that had always lurked at the edges of their relationship suddenly concrete and immediate, the reality crashing down on her with suffocating weight. Alexander was coldly enraged in a way that was somehow more frightening than shouting would have been, already making calls and planning retaliation with a ruthless efficiency that showed the criminal mastermind beneath the gentle lover. Clara saw that side of him fully unleashed for the first time, watched him issue orders that would result in violence and possibly death, and had to reconcile the man who held her tenderly with the one who could command such things without hesitation. That night, Alexander refused to leave her alone, stationing himself in the guest room where Clara was settled, sitting in a chair by the door like a sentinel who would not rest. Clara lay in the unfamiliar bed and stared at the ceiling, unable to sleep with adrenaline still coursing through her system and fear coiled tight in her chest. She finally gave up and got up, padding barefoot across the plush carpet to find him still awake, staring into the darkness with an expression that made her heart ache. She asked him what he would do, needing to hear it even though she already knew. Alexander told her he would end the threat permanently, his voice carrying absolute certainty, and Clara was disturbed by how easily he talked about violence, but understood it was his reality, the only language his world recognized. She asked him if he ever wished he could just walk away from all of it, her voice soft in the heavy silence of the guest room, and Alexander admitted he had, especially recently. But it was not that simple because there were too many people depending on him, too many enemies who would strike the moment he showed any weakness or hesitation. Clara moved from the bed to sit beside him in the chair that was clearly not designed for two people, taking his hand in both of hers and feeling the calluses and scars that marked a life of violence, and told him she did not regret being with him even knowing the cost, even understanding what it meant to be tied to someone like him. Clara remained at Alexander's mansion under heavy security for the following days, confined within walls that were luxurious but still felt like a cage, not allowed to leave or contact anyone outside without supervision. It was captivity dressed in silk sheets and gourmet meals, but captivity nonetheless, and she felt the loss of her hard-won independence like a physical ache. Eleanor was worried, calling and texting repeatedly, but Alexander had someone deliver a message assuring her that Clara was safe, though he could not provide details, which only partially satisfied her increasingly frantic roommate. The forced proximity intensified everything between Clara and Alexander in ways neither had anticipated, stripping away the careful distance and measured interactions that had protected them both. They shared meals at the long dining table that felt absurdly formal for just two people, conversations that stretched for hours and ranged from meaningful to mundane, and silences that were surprisingly comfortable despite the tension underlying everything. Alexander worked from home, converting one of the sitting rooms into a temporary office, and Clara glimpsed the full extent of his empire through the endless meetings and phone calls and decisions that affected hundreds of lives and millions of dollars. She also saw his exhaustion, the weight of responsibility that pressed down on his shoulders and lined his face, the toll of being the one everyone turned to for answers and protection and judgment. One afternoon, Clara found Alexander in his study, surrounded by papers and ledgers, tension radiating from his shoulders in waves she could almost see, and she hesitated in the doorway before stepping behind him and hesitantly beginning to massage the tight muscles of his neck and upper back. Alexander went completely still under her touch, every muscle locked, and then slowly, gradually relaxed as her fingers worked at the knots and tension, his head dropping forward and a low sound escaping him that sent heat pooling in her stomach. The moment shifted, the air changing from comfortable to charged, and he turned in the chair and pulled her into his lap with a certainty that left no room for doubt or hesitation. They kissed with desperate urgency, all the fear and danger and forced waiting breaking free at once, and Alexander stood with her wrapped around him and carried her to his bedroom without breaking the kiss. What followed was intense and consuming, both of them seeking connection and escape in each other, hands and mouths speaking what words could not express, and Clara lost herself in the feeling of his skin against hers, and the way he whispered her name like a prayer or a curse. Afterwards, they lay tangled together in sheets that smelled of him, Alexander holding Clara as if she might disappear if he loosened his grip, and in the dim light filtering through the heavy curtains, he told her things he confessed he had never told anyone. His fears about losing control or making the wrong choice, his regrets about the violence and compromises that stained his hands, his dreams of a different life that felt impossible but persisted anyway in the quiet hours of night. Clara shared her own secrets in return, the loneliness of her years in hiding when she trusted no one and let no one close, the constant fear that someone would recognize her or the past, would catch up and destroy the fragile life she had built. They were both damaged by their pasts, carrying wounds that had never properly healed, but in this moment they found solace in each other, a sense of being understood that neither had experienced before. The intimacy was not just physical, but emotional, a vulnerability neither had allowed themselves with anyone else, and Clara realized with absolute clarity that she had fallen completely in love with him, a thought that both terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. Alexander received intelligence that Greville was planning something bigger just 2 days after Clara had first shared his bed, the news arriving through Henry Carstairs, who appeared at the mansion with a grim expression that made Clara's stomach drop even before he spoke. There were whispers of an ambush, a coordinated strike involving not just Greville's own people, but hired contractors from out of state, professionals who would not hesitate or show mercy. Alexander called a meeting with his top people immediately, summoning them to the secure conference room in the east wing of the mansion, and Clara was present at his insistence despite the surprised and skeptical looks from the assembled men who clearly questioned what a cashier was doing in their strategic planning session. Henry and the others were openly dubious of her involvement, their expressions ranging from confused to dismissive, but Alexander made it clear with just a few sharp words that she was under his protection and had his complete trust, his tone brooking no argument or debate. The meeting was tense, the air thick with barely suppressed violence, and the smell of expensive cologne and gun oil, and Clara sat quietly in a chair, slightly behind Alexander's position at the head of the long mahogany table. Alexander outlined a plan to strike first, to eliminate Greville before he could move against them, his voice calm and methodical as he described surveillance positions and extraction routes and the precise timing required for a successful offensive. It would be dangerous and required precision timing, coordination between multiple teams, and a willingness to commit to lethal force without hesitation. Clara listened carefully, following the tactical discussion even though much of the terminology was unfamiliar, and then surprised everyone, including herself, by speaking up, her voice steadier than she felt. She pointed out that Greville expected Alexander to react with overwhelming force, that the rival boss was probably already preparing for a direct confrontation and had positioned his resources accordingly. What if they used that expectation against him, turning his assumptions into a vulnerability rather than trying to overcome his preparations head-on? She suggested a tactical misdirection, using herself as apparent bait to draw Greville out into a location of their choosing, while Alexander's forces positioned for a counterstrike that would catch him exposed and overconfident. The room went completely silent, every man turning to stare at her with expressions ranging from shock to something approaching respect, and Alexander immediately refused, his voice hard and his jaw tight, the idea of putting Clara in danger clearly unthinkable to him. But Clara pressed, leaning forward and meeting his eyes directly, arguing that she was already a target whether they acknowledged it or not, that hiding behind his walls would not keep her safe in the long term. If they controlled the situation and the timing and the location, they controlled the risk and turned her liability into an asset. Henry Carstairs, who had been silent throughout her proposal, grudgingly admitted the strategy had tactical merit, that it would draw Greville out and force him to commit resources to a location they could prepare and monitor. Alexander was visibly torn between tactical logic that recognized the soundness of the plan and his overwhelming need to protect her, his hands clenched on the table and his breathing controlled but strained. Clara stood and moved to his side, taking his hand in both of hers in front of all his men, and told him quietly but firmly that she trusted him to keep her safe, that she believed in his ability and his people, but she needed to be part of the solution rather than just the problem they were trying to manage. After a long, agonizing moment where she could see the war raging behind his eyes, Alexander agreed, but with extensive conditions that he outlined with meticulous detail, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. Clara would be wired with the best equipment available, surrounded by hidden security in overlapping coverage zones, and at the first sign of real danger beyond the acceptable parameters, she would be extracted immediately, whether the tactical objective was complete or not. The plan was executed with meticulous detail over the course of 48 hours, every contingency mapped and every position verified twice before Alexander would allow Clara anywhere near the operation. Clara was positioned at a neutral location, a closed restaurant in the warehouse district that Greville's people had suggested for a meeting, the building flanked by empty lots that provided clear sightlines for Alexander's hidden snipers and surveillance teams. The premise they had fed through carefully selected channels was that Clara wanted to negotiate her own safety separate from Alexander, that she was willing to provide information about his operations in exchange for Greville leaving her alone, a believable enough story given how often lovers betrayed each other in this world. Clara was terrified, but determined as Henry fitted her with the wire, the small device taped between her shoulder blades, and the microphone disguised as a pendant on a delicate chain around her neck. And she caught Alexander watching from across the room with an expression that made her chest ache. She wore simple clothes, jeans and a sweater that made her look vulnerable and civilian, and knew that Alexander's people surrounded the building in overlapping coverage zones, hidden in vehicles and empty buildings and rooftops with rifles and radios. Greville arrived exactly on time with 4 men, all of them armed and alert, and he was older than Alexander by perhaps a decade, with cold eyes that held no warmth or mercy, and a cruel smile that made Clara's skin crawl as he entered the empty restaurant. He circled Clara like a predator assessing prey, his expensive shoes clicking on the dusty floor, and told her she was foolish to think she could bargain, that her only value was as leverage against Alexander Thornhill, and that value would be extracted one way or another. Clara played her part with a trembling voice that was only partially acting, telling him she just wanted to be left alone, that she would tell him anything he wanted to know if he would just guarantee her safety. And she watched Greville's expression shift to satisfaction at her apparent weakness. He moved closer, reaching out to touch the tattoo on her neck with fingers that felt like ice, and told her that Alexander had made a critical mistake by caring about someone. That sentiment was a weakness that got men killed in their world. Clara forced herself not to flinch as he traced the symbol, and through the wire she knew Alexander was listening to every word, watching through the hidden cameras, and she could only imagine the control it was taking for him not to storm in immediately. Greville asked her about security at the mansion, about Alexander's routines and vulnerabilities, and Clara fed him information that sounded plausible, but was actually carefully constructed misdirection designed to reveal Greville's own plans through his reactions and follow-up questions. She was just starting to think they might actually pull this off when one of Greville's men, the one positioned by the door, suddenly stiffened and touched his ear, clearly receiving communication through his own earpiece, and announced that they had company, that someone had spotted Alexander's surveillance team on the rooftop across the street. Everything happened in seconds, the moment fracturing into chaos as Greville's expression shifted from smug satisfaction to cold calculation, and he grabbed Clara by the arm with bruising force, yanking her against him as a human shield, while his free hand produced a gun that pressed against her ribs with terrifying certainty. Clara's breath stopped, her entire body going rigid with primal fear, even as her mind screamed that this was not part of the plan, that Alexander's extraction protocols had not accounted for Greville moving this fast or this decisively. Through the wire she could hear shouting, Alexander's voice cutting through the noise with commands she could not fully process, and outside the restaurant windows she caught movement as his people repositioned, no longer hidden but scrambling to respond to the sudden shift in dynamics. Greville was backing toward the rear exit, dragging Clara with him, while his men formed a protective barrier and returned fire toward positions where Alexander's snipers had been moments before. The sound of gunshots deafening in the enclosed space and making Clara's ears ring with painful intensity. She struggled instinctively, but Greville only tightened his grip, his voice in her ear promising that Alexander would watch her die slowly if he did not stand down immediately, the words delivered with such casual cruelty that Clara knew he meant every syllable. Then the front door exploded inward and Alexander was there, moving with lethal purpose and flanked by Henry and 3 others, all of them armed and advancing with the coordinated precision of men who had done this 100 times before, and Clara saw something terrifying and beautiful in Alexander's face, a cold fury that was absolutely focused on Greville. The standoff lasted an eternity compressed into heartbeats, Greville shouting demands while Alexander approached with measured steps, his weapon trained but his eyes locked on Clara with an intensity that made her want to cry. And she could see him calculating angles and distances and acceptable losses with the part of his mind that had been trained since childhood for exactly this kind of crisis. Clara made a decision in that frozen moment. Refusing to be the helpless victim that got Alexander killed trying to save her, and she let her body go suddenly limp and heavy in Greville's grip, the unexpected dead weight making him stumble and shift his aim for just a fraction of a second. It was enough. Alexander fired twice, the shots so close together they sounded like one, and Greville's grip on Clara released as he fell backward with a look of shocked surprise, and then Clara was stumbling forward, and Alexander was there, catching her and pulling her behind him in one fluid motion, while Henry and the others secured the scene with brutal efficiency, neutralizing Greville's remaining men with cold professionalism. Clara was shaking so hard she could barely stand, adrenaline and terror flooding her system. But Alexander's arm around her was solid and real, and she buried her face against his chest while he murmured words she could not quite hear, but that sounded like reassurance and rage and relief all tangled together, his heart pounding as hard as hers beneath her cheek. The aftermath unfolded in carefully controlled chaos as Henry coordinated cleanup crews, and Alexander made phone calls to ensure the official narrative would be managed through his contacts in law enforcement, while Clara sat wrapped in a blanket in the back of an armored vehicle, feeling numb and disconnected from her own body as the adrenaline crash left her hollow and shaking. They returned to the mansion where Alexander refused to let her out of his sight, his hand constantly touching her, as if verifying she was real and whole, and she understood that something fundamental had shifted in him when Greville had put that gun against her ribs, that the cold control Alexander prided himself on had fractured in that moment and revealed something raw underneath. A doctor arrived to check Clara for injuries despite her insistence she was fine, and Alexander stood in the corner watching with an expression that made the doctor work quickly and efficiently before excusing himself. When they were finally alone in Alexander's bedroom, the silence stretched between them heavy with unspoken words, until Clara finally broke and started crying. Not delicate tears, but harsh sobs that shook her entire frame as the terror and violence of the evening overwhelmed her defenses. Alexander gathered her against him immediately, his arms tight and secure, and she felt him press his face into her hair as his own breathing turned ragged and uneven. He told her he was sorry, that he should never have allowed her anywhere near that situation, that the strategic value meant nothing compared to what he felt when he thought he might lose her, and Clara heard the raw truth beneath the words, the admission of feelings he had been guarding. She pulled back enough to see his face and found his eyes bright with unshed emotion, and she told him she had made the choice herself, that she was not some fragile thing that needed to be locked away, and that she had meant what she said before, about not regretting him. Alexander kissed her then, with a desperation that spoke of fear and relief and need, and Clara responded with equal intensity, both of them seeking to erase the memory of violence with connection and affirmation of life. They made love slowly this time, every touch deliberate and reverent, Alexander mapping her body as if memorizing proof of her survival, and afterwards he held her close and told her he loved her, the words simple but weighted with everything he was. Clara felt her heart expand and break and heal simultaneously, and she whispered the words back, admitting what she had known for weeks, but been too afraid to name. They lay tangled together as dawn began to lighten the windows, and Clara asked what happened now, whether Greville's death meant the threat was over. Alexander was quiet for a long moment, before admitting that it meant safety, for now. That his organization had absorbed what remained of Greville's operation, and the power balance had shifted decisively in his favor, but that their world would always carry danger, and she needed to decide if she could live with that reality long term. Clara listened to Alexander's question about whether she could live with the constant danger of his world, and felt the weight of everything that had brought them to this moment. from that first, terrifying day in the convenience store when she had protected Samuel and caught the attention of the most dangerous man in the city to this dawn after violence and confession. And she realized that the answer had been forming itself through every conversation and touch and crisis they had shared. She turned in his arms so she could see his face properly, the strong features softened by exhaustion and emotion, and told him that she had spent 5 years running from a life she never chose, living in shadows and working minimum wage jobs, and never allowing herself to connect with anyone, because connection meant risk and vulnerability. And she had been so focused on survival that she had forgotten what it meant to actually live. Alexander listened with that focused intensity she had come to know, his hand stroking slowly up and down her spine, and Clara continued, saying that being with him was terrifying and dangerous, and completely outside anything she had planned for herself. But it was also the first time since her father died that she felt truly alive, that someone saw all of her, including the parts marked by violence and legacy, and still chose her anyway. She admitted that his world would always carry shadows, that she understood there would be more threats and more difficult decisions. But she had learned something important about herself through this whole ordeal, which was that she was stronger than she had believed and that hiding from danger did not actually keep her safe. It just kept her alone. Alexander's eyes had gone bright and fierce as she spoke, and he pulled her closer as if he could absorb her into himself, and Clara told him that yes, she could live with the reality of his life, because the alternative was living without him, and that felt infinitely worse than any external threat. He kissed her then with a tenderness that made her chest ache, and when he pulled back, he told her that he had already begun putting plans in motion to legitimize more of his operations, that he could not walk away entirely without leaving a power vacuum that would harm innocent people, but he could slowly transition toward legal business and reduce the violence, and that having her in his life made him want to be better than the man his legacy had demanded he become. Clara felt hope unfurl in her chest, fragile but real, and she asked him what their future might look like if they chose it together. Alexander was quiet for a moment, his fingers tracing the tattoo on her neck that had started this entire chain of events. And then he told her he wanted to give her everything she had been denied, safety and choice, and a home that was truly hers, and that he wanted to build something new with her, something that honored the strength they had both developed through trauma, while leaving space for softer things like trust and partnership and love. Clara knew it would not be simple or easy, that there would be complications and adjustments and moments of doubt, but lying there in the growing light with Alexander's heartbeat steady beneath her palm, she felt certain that this was the right choice, that sometimes the most dangerous path was also the one that led to the truest version of yourself, and that she was done running from the possibility of happiness just because it came with risk.